Welcome everybody to the next episode of the Cannabis Review. I'm delighted to be joined on this episode by Rhys Cohen. Rhys is delivered a number of consulting projects for a lot of Australia's leading cannabis companies, had his own previous consulting agency. He is now the Senior Corporate Communications Manager at the massive Cann Group, and he also sits on the Non-Executive Advisory Board of the Lambert Initiative for Cannabinoid Therapeutics at the University of Sydney. Also, the editor-at-large was previously the editor-at-large of Cannabiz, Australia's largest B2B industry magazine. How are you keeping, Rhys?
I'm grand, thanks. Yeah, it's a beautiful afternoon here in Melbourne.
Delighted to have you on, mate. It's a lovely sunny morning here in Dublin, so glad that our times was able to come together. Can you maybe give everybody a quick little overview of how you got to the position you are in the cannabis industry and maybe your dissertation that you did in the sector?
Sure. I've actually done a couple, funnily enough. So I got started in cannabis in 2015. I did my honours thesis in the politics and economics of cannabis legalization with a focus on Colorado at the time. Medicinal cannabis got legalized in Australia just a few months after I finished my degree. So I started calling myself a consultant and built myself a website and sort of went from there. I've had a few different incarnations over the last few years. As you mentioned, I'm on the non-executive advisory board of the Lambert Initiative. I also used to work there for about a year and a half or two in a sort of project management capacity. I've also previously run Fresh Leaf Analytics, which is Australia's most prominent sort of market intelligence company for the medicinal cannabis industry. I spent some time working with Martin at Cannabiz, and I was very sad to see him go. And recently, as of a few weeks ago, I've joined Cann Group as their senior corporate communications manager. So talking and writing and working on a bit of commercial strategy as well is kind of the overview.
Perfect. So a complete in-depth knowledge you seem to have of Australia. The topics I wanted to talk to you today about, first and foremost, was the politics and economics of cannabis. In terms of the politics in Australia, did you find that the right-wing side of the government were against the legalization of cannabis, and it was the Democrats and the Greens, shall we say, driving the initiative forward? And do you see that is that the same template that you see around the world? Are you starting to see the right-leaning parties swing into the cannabis industry a lot more?
It's interesting. I mean, clearly there's very different conversations to be had about medicinal versus non-medicinal cannabis and the politics around that. So medical cannabis was legalized in Australia under a conservative government in 2016. But it had unanimous political support from every party of every political spectrum. No one in Australia who's in politics disagrees with the legalization of medicinal cannabis. Obviously, there's some dispute about how exactly it should work in practice, but it has comprehensive support, and that's reflected in the general population as well. Probably up around 85, 90% of the Australians support medicinal cannabis. When we're talking about non-medical cannabis, popular support is closer to 50% of Australians think that cannabis should be legalized for non-medical purposes. But once again, it depends how you ask the questions in the surveys, so to speak. And at the moment, neither major party supports any change to cannabis policy. And it is, like you say, the parties further to the left, the Greens and the Recent Party and other left-wing parties that support such a move, as well as the hardcore libertarians, which we tend to associate more with the right wing of politics. And that sort of weird coalition of left-wing, far left-wing politics and hardcore libertarians is something that we see in many other places around the world, in particular Colorado and many US states as well. There's been an unholy marriage of those political forces that have pushed through non-medical legalization. But it's not, further cannabis law reform in Australia is not really a big topic of conversation, although we had our federal elections over the weekend, and it was encouraging or interesting at least to see that the legalized cannabis party, a grassroots movements with no real sort of resources to put into campaigning, managed to get nearly 7% of the Senate vote in the state of Queensland and between 2 and 4% of the Senate vote in our other states and territories as well. So it's maybe becoming more of a political issue, but we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, so 7% would have to be a good chunk of change of voters that would actually go out of their way to give their number one vote to a party dedicated specifically just to cannabis legalization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's pretty significant. And what was interesting to me in particular was that it was Queensland was the standout state. And what we know about Queensland with regards to cannabis is that about 50% of all of the approvals to prescribe medicinal cannabis in Australia are currently issued by prescribers based in Queensland. So we're not quite sure if that also correlates to patients, because people get prescribed across state lines, and that's becoming more and more common, and we don't really know where the patients are. But the prescribers and the clinic networks and the pharmacy networks that they work within are based in Queensland. So something's in the water.
Okay, so basically, in terms of the medical industry, you've got, let's say, 70-80% favorability, but when it gets down to recreational, it seems to be around that 50% mark, seems to be the kind of magic number worldwide, where there was New Zealand's legislation that they had. It'd be the same over in Europe to a degree. Do you see that number shifting with the economics that the medical industry is providing for Australia? Are they starting to see a little bit of income come into the government, where they're like, actually, hold on a minute, we'd like 5x or 8x this kind of revenue for our tax covers?
Potentially. I mean, look, the medical industry is growing really rapidly. Best estimates suggest that last year the industry made maybe $200 million worth of revenue. This year it'll probably at least double. So the money's coming in. Whether that is what's changing people's hearts and minds, I'm not so sure about. If you look at popular support for non-medical legalization over time, it has increased, a couple of percentage points every year for many years. So, which predates medical legalization. So maybe it has more to do with the reduction in stigma and the normalization of cannabis, instead, more so than people seeing dollar signs in their eyes, because there is an opportunity here. There's a commercial opportunity, but it's not easy work, and it's not enormously profitable right off the bat.
Yeah, I think the R&D that needs to be put into this industry will scare a lot of companies away when you see the kind of capital, how extensive it is, and how quickly the cash burn rate can be in some of these companies.
Yeah, it gets pretty real pretty quick. So Cann Group, that I'm now part of, we've just finished the first stage of a really massive construction project for our sort of vertically integrated cultivation and manufacturing facility in Australia. And the cost of that's, I think, somewhere around $120 million at the moment. We've also just earlier this year launched a full phase 3 placebo-controlled randomized clinical trial to investigate our proprietary CBD capsule product, to investigate whether it can help people with sleep disturbance, and which obviously we're trying to get that into the over-the-counter CBD channel in Australia. So, if you only took those two expenses, that'd be more than most cannabis companies are prepared to put into anything. And then, of course, there's all the money that we spent over the years on staff, R&D, developing new genetic lines in our cultivars, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not for the faint of heart.
Yeah, well, I think if you have the overview of the industry, that's the one place Australia you can see is the genetics and the specific seed types that you guys can create and then export all over the world is going to be the kind of moneymaker, I think, from that territory.
I think two places where I think we'll play really well. One is at the plant end of the spectrum, like you say, because Australia, we're a banana republic. All we do is dig up and send out coal, and we do primary produce really well. So wheat, cotton, rice. We've put, as a country, a lot of money and a lot of focus over a lot of years into improving those sorts of crops, and so we have this great R&D machinery that can now be put towards cannabis and the cannabis plant itself. So we're really accelerating some progress there in some really exciting ways. So that's the first one. And then the second one would be at the pointy end, at the clinical end, because we do punch above our weight globally in terms of clinical trials in particular. It's comparatively quite quick and easy to conduct clinical trials in Australia compared to the US or Europe. And our regulatory standards for therapeutic goods and for clinical research are at a level where, it's not like doing a clinical trial in a country whom I won't disparage as an example. But we are comparable in terms of the quality of research that we do with North America and Europe.
Amazing. The next topic I wanted to jump onto is industry analysis. Now, I know you've got a lot of expertise in this. Can you maybe give everybody, let's say, 2 good sources that you think are places where you can see good industry analysis? Because as we talked just before coming on, there's a lot of places that are just literally seem to be making up numbers to tell each other how great this industry could possibly be, whereas a real financial breakdown and analysis of some of these sectors would not deliver the numbers that some of these guys are producing.
Yeah. I guess it depends what you mean by industry analysis and which industry. So like in Australia, for example, there are very few sources of information. One has been Fresh Leaf Analytics. The other, I would say, in terms of cannabis
coverage would be Cannabiz. I think they do exceptional coverage. Obviously, I would say that I'm conflicted, but I really recommend that you check them out. What I'm excited about actually is more mainstream pharma business intelligence companies starting to service medicinal cannabis companies. So we're seeing that now, like, companies that have been set up that have been monitoring, say, for example, retail sales of medicines through pharmacies in Australia for big pharma companies in order to provide them with insights. They're now also capturing information on medicinal cannabis products. And, it's a classic cannabis thing, right? To assume that you need to build a cannabis specific solution for a problem from the ground up. Well, in actual fact, people are doing this sort of stuff all the time already for other industries, and there's an opportunity to piggyback off it. Globally, though, I would say, MJ Biz, obviously, and I think Prohibition Partners have been getting a lot better. But the challenge is, all forecasts are wrong. Some forecasts are useful. This industry is still really a how long's a piece of string operation. So I try as best I can and avoid forecasting out any longer term than 12 months.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think the cannabis industry is almost like a golf shot at the moment. You can think you're going to hit the same shot. It might look like the exact same shot, but the chances of you being able to replicate the exact same shot over and over again are pretty much slim to none.
But as a general piece of advice, I'd say, like, the sources and the forecasts that I trust the most are the ones that are the most transparent and the most comprehensive in disclosing their methodology. You can have a wild forecast that's, out of left field. Maybe it's too conservative or people think it's too ambitious. But so long as you've got your methodology and you're explicit about it, people can argue with the methodology, and that's a fine argument to have. Arguing with the end number is kind of pointless unless you're actually talking about the nuts and bolts.
Yeah, I agree with you. Last topic before I let you go, I just wanted to get a quick little overview of everybody of Australia, that some people who might not know the industry and understand it. It's medical only, no recreational. A couple of the leading companies that you see, do you see Europe being an actual realistic market for Australian companies? Because we see Little Green Farm up in Denmark at the moment supplying the German industry, but at the same time, we've got all the Canadian companies supplying the German industry. And not to burst their bubble, but there's going to be German companies who are going to supply the German industry. So how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, totally. I mean, look, we've got our own situation here at the moment in terms of oversupply. There's over 300 products that are available to be prescribed in Australia at the moment. Most of those are imported from overseas. Many of those are of questionable quality and compliance standards. What I'm really excited about is earlier this year, the Australian government implemented new rules. They'll go into effect in about 12 months' time. But from June next year, we are going to require all products that are imported to Australia to be manufactured to the same quality standards as products that are made here. And Australia is a signatory to the international sort of GMP, the PICS convention. So, we have mutual recognition agreements in place with Germany, for example. Any medicinal cannabis product that's made in Australia is already head and shoulders above any product that's been manufactured in a GPP facility or in a GMP facility in a non-MRA country. So we will have we have a shot at exports and at servicing the international market. We'll need more than just Germany and Germany's medical market to sustain just the Australian companies that are exporting. But as we see more countries opening up and markets continue to grow, I think, the future of the industry is pretty strong. And Australia is part of that. I think we're, outside of North America, there's Australia, Germany, and Israel are the only meaningful markets for prescription medicinal cannabis access globally. And then, of course, there's all of the CBD stuff going on in the UK, which is a bit of a different kettle of fish.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting couple of years now to see how all the pieces fall on the cards. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. For anybody who wants to follow Rhys, go to Rhys Cohen on Twitter at Rhys Cohen. And if you want to know anything about the Cann Group, the website is below there for everybody to check out. All the details will be in the subscription. Thank you very much, Rhys, for taking your time to talk to us today. It's been very informative, Nathan, and I hope you have the great rest of your day.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody. Until next time.